Okay, I should start this story by giving a bit of background so that you understand the situation a bit better. I, a 4'9", 16 female at the time, had 2 dogs who were brothers from the same litter. Now, being boxers, they were relatively big and quite protective when they needed to be. Vince was longer, much taller than his brother, and is usually the kind to sleep through a hurricane if we had one. His brother Maori was shorter, but more muscled and stronger. Usually these 2 were with me 24/7, as my mother used to work a lot and I was usually alone most of the day, sometimes even until after dark. This never really bothered me. I'd been left alone at home like this since I was 11. It never struck me that I had a reason to be worried. One day, my mum was working later. I was doing some household chores, feeding the dogs, doing dishes, stuff like that. I continued doing what I always had, a routine of tidying the house I had done every day for years. As I went to take the trash out of the bin, I started walking towards the door when Maori stepped in front of me. I tried moving around him, telling him to get out of the way, but he refused to budge. This was certainly odd, and looking back on it now, a few years later, I realize he was probably trying to stop me from walking outside. We continued like this for a few moments, me trying to get past him and him, of course, never moving from his spot. He was quite a heavy and big dog. It was difficult to lift him and even harder to get him away from something. Now, in the time that we had been going back and forth with this interaction, Vince stayed happily asleep on his dog bed. I should note that from my kitchen you can see the living room and bathroom. Usually we used the side door from the kitchen to enter or exit the house since it attached to the carport. After a couple more minutes, I heard something I hadn't expected when I made one last desperate attempt to move Maori from his spot. He growled, which wasn't unusual as he'd growled plenty in his life. What was unusual was that he growled at me. He had never done that before, not once. But for that reason and that reason alone, I decided not to take the trash out that night. I simply tossed it in another room and let it be. A short time passed, maybe an hour or so. I'd gotten settled in my chair to watch some movie while I waited for my mum to come home. While I was watching the movie, I suddenly heard a quiet knock at the side door. As I mentioned earlier, you can clearly see the living room from the kitchen, so I heard the knock pretty well. It was already after dark, so I figured it was just my mother, and she had somehow forgotten her keys. I got up, went into the kitchen, and out the corner of my eye I saw the hook near the door. The keys were not there. To some people that's not a big deal, but to me, it meant that the person knocking on my door was in fact not my mother. My mum is a bit of a routine-obsessed person, so if she actually had forgotten her keys, they would always be on the hook. I took a deep breath, preparing myself to just not answer the door if they didn't leave, or to just tell them I wasn't interested in whatever was happening and that they should leave. Thinking about it now, I really wish I hadn't even looked out the window. I wish I had just sat back down, called my mum and stayed out of sight. But of course, I walked in front of the door and immediately came face to face with a figure on the other side of the window. Now it was really dark, with just my neighbor's lights shining from his porch, so I could only make out a couple things on this guy. He was tall, me having to peer up at him through the window to look at his face. He had long hair that looked like a shadow over his shoulders in the dim light. But the only facial feature I could really see were his eyes. God, I wish I hadn't seen them. I could see the spark of interest flare in them as he perked up when he saw me. They were wide and staring down at me. He took a step towards my door, stepping up on the first 2 steps. I heard him say something along the lines of, "My car broke down nearby. Can I come in and use your phone?" Immediately, I thought of every bad thing that I had ever heard happening to a teenager at home alone and tried to compose my nerves. I'm not sure what it was, but something told me not to trust this man standing on the other side of my door. I shouted back a quick no and an apology, hoping he was telling the truth and would just go to the next house over. But he didn't. Instead, he simply said it again, quite a bit louder. I thought for a quick moment he hadn't heard me, but then again, I know now that he most likely had. So I instead became a bit more confident. "I'm sorry, I can't help you, go to the next house," I shouted louder. For a moment he paused, as if contemplating what to do. Then he knocked again, louder than the first time I'd heard it. My heart rate increased as I stared at him. When I didn't react, he started to loudly bang against the door. I took a step back, praying to whatever God that he would either leave or my mum would be home early. I was usually a quiet girl, but my mum, she was a badass redneck with a raptor knife. She could take him. He started to bang on the glass after a moment, my mind racing 1,000 miles per hour. Should I hide? Should I run? My phone was in the other room and I was scared to take my eyes off the guy. I was sure he would break through the glass. The banging was vibrating my eardrums and apparently it was vibrating Maori's too. I saw him creeping up past the doorway, bending his head, teeth bared. He started to bark loudly. The guy stopped a moment, trying to see into the window at the floor where Maori stood. When he stopped barking, the guy mistakenly tried to jiggle the door handle. Now that's when Vince woke up. I swear to God, for a dog that was dead asleep 5 seconds prior, I'd never seen him move that fast ever. In only 2 seconds, Vince had his paws on the door, growling like a hellhound at the devil's side at this man outside my door. The guy jumped, fell back, and fucking bolted. I heard him say something as he started to run and saw another shadow. My mum came home shortly after. I had sprinted across my carport to my neighbour's. We called the police after I explained what had happened, and my neighbour had dragged his shotgun out before they even got there. He had insisted on looking for the guy. The police had said someone had tried to pick the lock on my front door, but there was a lot of stuff in front of it and it was really old, so it didn't open anymore. I went to bed that night uneasy, and so very thankful I had 2 dogs who were not only strong and big, but one that was vigilant and one that could practically kill if you let him. A few weeks went by and we hadn't heard from the cops, so eventually I stopped trying to think about it. Another month went by, and although I was a bit scared of being home alone, nothing else seemed to happen. Then we got another visit from the cops. What they told me made my heart sink into my chest and still gives me chills to this day. They had caught the guys and realized they were stalking me. Yes, guys, plural. There were 2 guys that had apparently been stalking me without my knowledge for months. They had several photos of me, words they had written over them. Awful words. The police had been fairly adamant that I changed my locks, since they caught 2 guys and there was evidence of a third. We moved shortly after that. I still pass by that house sometimes when I go to visit friends or do stuff around that area. A chill runs down my spine every time I do. To think that they never caught one of the guys was scary enough. The fact that they tried to break into my house was worse, not to mention that I hadn't known they were watching me. I still think about it even now, a few years later. I dread to think about what would have happened if my dogs weren't there, and I dread to think about, even worse, what they had planned to do to me if I had opened the door, or they had successfully broken in. I suppose they weren't expecting my dogs, since our backyard is fenced and they mostly stayed indoors since it was so hot where I lived. I thank the universe every day that I had them, especially now. My mum never worked until after dark again after that, which, in all honesty, was fine with me. So to the man they still haven't caught. Let's not meet. As always, guys, thank you so much for listening. If you want to support us, please check out our Patreon. There's also bonus episodes on there. Links are down below. Make sure you're subscribed. You would never want to miss out on a new video, would you now? So go do that, and I cannot wait to see you in the next one. Until next time, guys, peace out.